second last seminar of this term for the Empire Seminar, the Seminar on Comparative Political Economy. I'm very, very happy to have Ursula Huws back here again. Ursula is a very close and dear friend. Her great essay, Material World, now a decade ago, which became the basis for her really quite celebrated book, The Making of a Cybertariat, with Monthly Review Press. Ursula is not a full-time academic. She has now for 30 years, having left academia in the early 80s, I think, managed to remain a very active intellectual and put bread on the table through being quite a good grantswoman while doing the kind of critical work that we're only supposed to do when we're tenured Marxists in university. She heads up a research outfit called an Analytica. She is the founder and editor of this very, very important journal on work organization, labor, and globalization. This is the most recent issue. You should subscribe. It's an online journal as well. I'll pass it around. This is called Working at the Interface, Call Center Labor in a Global Economy. And very much in that vein, given Ursula's very important research on value chains in the division of labor in the process of globalization, I asked her, since she was here as a visiting professor and for a conference at Western in London, whether she would come and speak on the changing division of labor in the crisis. And she's agreed to do that, and I'm really glad you're here.
Well, thank you very much, Leo, for that very generous introduction. I have case studies of the restructuring of work and the international relocation of work. And of course, all the field work for that project was done in 2006, 2007. So I've got lots and lots and lots of information about what happened up to 2007, and really rather little about what's actually happened since the crisis. So I've probably got more questions than I've got answers. But anyway, I'll give it a go. But I want to start off with just presenting a kind of framework within which to think about globalization of labour, because it's actually it's something for which there are almost no statistics. You know, it's actually a very, very difficult thing to do empirical research on, and I think it's important to see it as a double process. The movement of people to jobs and the movement of jobs to people. They're both different facets of globalization. They tend to be studied completely separately. People talk about migration studies as being like one category of things to look at, and the study of offshoring is seen as something completely different. But in fact, the two are very integrally connected. And in trying to kind of analyse these two kinds of movements, I came up with a rather crude classification system, a typology, of thinking at jobs in terms of jobs that are fixed, that have to be carried out in one geographical location, and jobs that are footloose. And then, of course, there are other jobs which I call fractured jobs, which have characteristics of both fixedness and footlooseness, and which tend to be the jobs that are confronted with the most extreme sort of assaults by employers in the form of restructuring, because it's precisely because of their hybrid nature that they're so open to restructuring. And of course, one of the ironies of the present phase of globalization is that the so to speak, the fixed jobs are done by the footloose people, and the footloose jobs tend to be done by people who have always lived in that location. I won't go on about the fractured category. First of all, let's talk about the fixed jobs, because these are, you know, there are a huge number of activities that require a physical presence on a particular spot of ground: cleaning, construction, agriculture, personal care services, food preparation, mining, and some production activities. And what is extraordinary about the current phase of globalization is that almost all those jobs are done by migrant workers. in almost every economy you look at. I mean, even if you go to Thailand, you find Nepalese workers doing these kind of jobs. The patterns of migration around the world are extraordinarily complex. They're physically strenuous, they're low-qualified jobs. This tendency of informalisation is very, very pronounced in these kinds of jobs. I think if we look back 30, 40 years in countries like Canada or Europe, you know, these were kind of, a lot of these jobs were jobs that were done by organised workers, organised working class workers who were citizens of the countries in which they were working. And increasingly that's no longer the case. And of course, you know, these are the worst jobs. They're precarious, they're low paid, they're stressful, they're where the health hazards are, etc. And any discussion of offshoring, of sort of mental work or immaterial work or white-collar work or whatever, has to be seen in a context of understanding that those white-collar workers have physical needs which are met by these kind of workers. You know, their kids need to be looked after, their houses need to be clean, their offices need to be clean, etc. And there's even an argument that the entry of women into the workforce in large numbers, certainly in many European countries, and I guess in North America too, was bought at the expense of, you know, the low-paid labour of immigrant workers who clean their houses and look after their kids, so they can participate in the labour force as kind of surrogate men, because those are the only terms on which they can get decent jobs in the workforce. So one cannot separate those two kinds of jobs. They happen in the same physical spaces and they interact in complex ways. Footloose jobs, we've obviously, you know, seen an enormous increase in, you know, what has now come to be called offshoring, which has been enabled by telecommunications, digitisation of information, the increasing interoperability of systems, so that you can go anywhere in the world and a big administration, you know, they'll be using Microsoft, they'll be using SAP, they'll be using technologies with standard interfaces that enable information to be switched from one location to another very, very seamlessly, and a workforce with the same generic skills, you know, Excel, Word, InDesign, etc. Standard software packages that can be operated by anywhere in the world, and a spread of ICT literacy, which hasn't just spontaneously emerged, but which has been consciously driven by the policies of the World Bank and the European Union in linking their education aid to developing countries, for instance, to certain targets in terms of computer literacy, in terms of speaking global languages, who have insisted that universities, higher education institutes, teach their kids to the standards, certification standards of Cisco and Microsoft and all these other global companies. This is a process which has, of course it's contradictory, and this ICT literacy has been very liberating for a lot of these workers, in the same way that basic literacy and numeracy was liberating for working class people in the 19th century. But nevertheless, it's had the effect of creating a global reserve army of information workers. So we have a new global division of labour in information processing work, as well as in manufacturing, mapping on to the same terrain as a new global division of labour based on the movement of people. Although the movement of people, of course, is impeded by all sorts of political barriers that are not put in place of the movement of information or the movement of capital. So we have a restructuring of employment in time and space that it seems to me can only be understood as part of a broader context of industrial reorganisation, which is not just a recomposition of a decomposition of firms and sectors, but also of labour processes and of occupational identities. This can only be understood as a sort of a continuum. Now the problem is that in terms of actually collecting data, having statistics on employment, there aren't any. There aren't any useful statistics. We have trade statistics, we have employment statistics that are based on very anachronistic classifications of occupations and sectors. And I would argue there isn't yet a single overarching conceptual framework within which we can actually model the interconnectedness of economies. So I'm going to talk, before I get on to what Leo wants me to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually conceptualise how the interconnectedness of all these different, so to speak, units of labour around the world. It requires, what is needed is a model that looks both at how units of labour are interconnected within national economies, but also internationally. And the traditional units of economic analysis, enterprises, establishments, sectors, really are inadequate for this purpose. Having spent 20 years trying to find ways to measure offshore outsourcing using existing statistics. I mean, I tried everything. I tried looking at VAT records, I tried looking at trade figures, employment statistics. They're just, at the moment, is not a unit you can use. Because of convergence between sectors, if you look at something like a multimedia product, the companies that make it, some of them are classified as toy companies, some of them are software companies, some of them are hardware companies, some of them are publishing companies, some of them are broadcasting companies, etc. If you look at the sectoral statistics, it's not going to tell you anything about the emergence of multimedia. Because of technological change, of course, because of the complete lack of consistency in how occupations are classified in different countries. And of course because of the way categories are culturally constructed in different ways, in different national frameworks. For instance, in Germany, the way they construct definitions of occupations which is linked to particular qualifications is totally different from how you'd define an occupation here in Canada. I'm not going to go into great detail, but just say that we have this huge problem of developing a model. And it seems to me that the ingredients of such a model are absolutely not new. I mean, you can go back to the 18th century Enlightenment, and you can find all the ingredients, it seems to me, of a model of what you might call value chains, but I have a problem with that concept, which I'll come on to later. The first key concept is the division of labour, Adam Smith. The second key concept is the labour theory of value, which is also to be found in Adam Smith, obviously elaborated and critiqued by Marx and developed in but they're in its fundamentals in Adam Smith. And Smith, incidentally, unlike Marx, also argues absolutely explicitly that services contribute to the added value which is generated. Anyway, he talks about the wages of the servant, of the miller, being incorporated in the price of flour, for instance. The third key concept, of course, is that of comparative advantage, which adds a spatial dimension to the division of labour. And it seems to me that there are still important things to... People laugh at me when I say this, but I think it's quite important also to go back to Quinet, who's the tableau économique, which you're probably familiar with, who was a sort of dim and distant ancestor of the input-output tables, which form part of the national accounts of every economy, and which is still just about the only the crudest measure that you have of outsourcing sourcing between sectors within a national economy, but of course not internationally. And this mouse doesn't want to work. What's it doing? Oh, here we are. Anyway, put these together, all these insights from the 18th century, and you have the ingredients, a model of what, depending which tradition you come from, you might want to think of as a value chain, or a filière, which is a French concept in the French tradition, or indeed a network, which is basically, that says businesses are broken down into trades, branches, or functions, however you want to call them, that the more specialised this division of labour is, the more value is added in each operation. That the comparative advantage of regions makes it profitable to introduce a spatial dimension to this division of labour. But as Adam Smith says, this is constrained by the limits of the free operation of the market and movements of capital. And Adam Smith actually also even talks about European policy, amazingly, I don't quite know what he means by it, as being an impediment to the spatial division of labour, because it artificially raises the wages in some countries. And I don't know what European policies there were in place at the time, but clearly it was some kind of poor law or something that subsidised workers. So, and also that centralised governance is necessary for the functioning of this spatial division of labour, and this is absolutely key. And also, this is kind of not so explicit in the 18th century theory, but that the inputs and outputs of goods and services flow laterally between sectors as well as vertically within them, which is a real problem with value chain theory. So, you put all this together, and you get a picture whereby the dynamics of growth and competitiveness within firms and between firms actually create this kind of constantly shifting landscape, well, creative destruction, whatever you want to call it, which is what's been going on so dramatically in the last 15 years or so. Which operates at the level, as I said earlier, at the level of firms and sectors, and at the level of labour processes and skills. And putting all these together coherently is quite a challenge, but it seems to me an absolutely necessary challenge to address in order to actually understand how restructuring happens and what happens to workers in that process and what happens to their working lives in that process, which is what we try to address in this big research project which has just come to an end. Right. Just to sort of recap on some of these different approaches. You've obviously got world systems theory has made some very important contributions to this. This what you might call value chain theory, with this concept of, they actually talk about commodity chains in that literature mainly, but the idea of boxes that sort of make inputs and outputs to each other, and the quite interesting idea that the kind of universal economic logic which governs the relationship between these boxes is superimposed onto a much more complex and differentiated cultural landscape. So you've got, if you like, big social differences between different places in the global division of labour, even while you've got the same economic logic going on, which is always a challenge if you're doing empirical research, to put together those two, like structure and agency, or whatever it is, however you want to think of it. And that approach in this, this classic work on the new international division of labour in 1974 was a similar kind of model of, that's what was very influential on me, I have to say, in the 70s, that book. But then we also have this 20th century French concept of filière, which are seen much more as organic flows of goods and services across a whole economy, And this concept has been picked up very much in development economics, people looking at agriculture in Africa and stuff like that. And it has its appeal, because it does enable you to see the whole economy as one, although it's mainly been used to look at things like energy supply, the flow of electricity across an economy, or supply of food or whatever. And of course we've got Castells and his networks, which I'm not going to waste a lot of time on, but it's been very influential in a lot of the literature on the global division of labour. And it does have the advantage of letting you see lateral communications between firms and looking at clusters, the way the economic geographers look at the growth of economic clusters and so on. It has been very useful and influential in that field. And then, of course, in the management literature, you've got Porter with his value chains in 1985, using the concept of the business function as the basic unit. And this is important not so much for its intrinsic value, but because 2 generations of managers who've done MBAs have been taught this stuff. And this is the way managers think. Whether it's in India, whether it's in the United States, you interview managers in IT firms or whatever, they talk about moving up the value chain, moving down the value chain. If you do a survey of companies and you use the term business function, they immediately understand exactly what you're talking about. And it's quite ironic, because it's also the way Marx thought. and I found myself in this very peculiar position. I did a survey, a very big survey in 18 countries back in 2000, using the business function as a unit of analysis to measure offshore outsourcing. And it's now been picked up by Eurostat, by the OECD, by the Bureau of Labour Statistics in the United States. They're all thinking, oh, isn't this brilliant, using the business function as a way of understanding outsourcing. And it came from Karl Marx, It's kind of quite gratifying. Anyway, but of course that has given rise to all this literature by people like Gary Gareffi and Tim Sturgeon, and there's a big literature on value chains, which is what you find if you Google value chains. This is the stuff you come across, which is basically going back to Porter, but with a bit of world systems theory mixed in to give themselves academic credibility. And the thing is, each of these approaches has strengths and weaknesses. The network metaphor absolutely fails to enable you to analyse the power relations between firms, which seems to me to be a huge weakness. The filière metaphor captures flows within national economies really well, but doesn't give you the international dimension. And also doesn't give you the power relationships either. The chain metaphor gives you the power relationships, and it's quite good for giving you the spatial picture. But it absolutely doesn't show you any of those lateral links, like the supplies of services to manufacturing industries. And you can't use it looking at a regional economy or a national economy. So that's terribly weak as well. So it seems to me we have to find an underlying logic that enables you to use any of those 3 metaphors, if you like. And it seems to me that it's possible to do that, which is that you see, it's a bit like Lego, really. Thinking of it as if you've got a lot of Lego blocks, and you can use them to build chains, or to build networks, or to build filière. And you have to find what your basic brick is. And the basic brick, it seems to me, is an aggregation of tasks. It's labour. Labour is the basis of all this stuff. Units of labour, tasks, or whatever you want to call them, aggregated in various ways, form the basic building blocks of this division of labour, whichever way you want to assemble or reassemble them. But of course these labour processes are a constant process of restructuring, because there's constant management is always trying to squeeze more productivity out of labour, etc. The story that we all know. It seems to me that in order to understand like the interconnectedness of economies globally, you absolutely have to go back to what's happening at the level of the individual labour process, and then sort of see the process, how that builds up into these basic building blocks, which can then be these modules, if you like, which can then be recombined in all these different ways. And here, of course, this is where we learn from, from Taylor and from Braverman, and this labour process theory comes in. So, the single underlying, forgive me, some of you may have seen this slide before because it's a model I've been using now for about, I don't want to say how many years, but it seems to me that the same logic underlies all forms of restructuring of labour. And that is that in the first stage, tacit knowledge is codified, workers' tacit knowledge is codified. As soon as it's codified, processes can be standardised. As soon as they can be standardised, it becomes possible to manage them by results or by performance indicators, instead of having some kind of co-presence. As soon as it's possible to manage them by results, they can be managed remotely, because you count the output. That's all you need to do, provided some sort of discipline is in place, either in the form of the wage system or local management or whatever. As soon as it can be displaced spatially or in time, the organisation can be disaggregated. You've got the beginnings of a value chain, in other words. And this disaggregation can take two forms. It can either be a contractual elaboration, it can be outsourced, or it can be a spatial disaggregation, it can be relocated. And these different forms of restructuring can be arranged in a matrix like this. And of course all these forms of restructuring are very, very visible, like in the case studies that we did in this project, across a lot of different sectors, including very high-skilled tasks like R&D and very low-skilled tasks like food preparation. We found examples of all these things in almost all of them. Work can be restructured without being relocated or spatially, just by reskilling the workers, market testing them, etc. Introducing it. They can be kept still on the same premises, but outsourced through bringing in temporary workers, through, say for instance, outsourcing the IT to an IT company that their workers work on your premises, for instance, through setting up spin-off companies, through body shopping, bringing in software engineers from India or whatever it is. They can still be employees but be relocated to their homes, to a back office, to customers' premises, whatever. Or you can have your fully fledged offshore outsourcing, which again can take many different forms. It can be from a powerful company to a small captive outsourced supplier in India, or it can be to a very big global company. And the balance of power is totally different in those two situations. But what we are seeing very, very dramatically, and I looked at the figures in preparation for this talk today, and these trends are still there. The fastest growing companies in the world right now, and possibly in the history of capitalism actually, are global outsourced business service suppliers: Accenture, EDS, Siemens Business Services, Capital, Microsoft, enormous global companies which supply outsourced services not to manufacturing companies, to other services companies, but also to the public sector. And their most rapid growth is through supplying the public sector. And the reason they're growing so invisibly is because a lot of that growth comes through transfer of employees. So, take some examples in the UK. The BBC outsources its website to Siemens Business Services. 600 BBC employees overnight become employees of Siemens Business Services. The Inland Revenue outsource its IT. 4,000 IT workers then become employees, and could be the same multinational company. And so they're growing through these transfers of personnel. at an extraordinary, rapid rate, and of course acquiring the knowledge and the know-how through these transfers that then enable them to go and sell their services below cost, very often, in order to get a foot in the market, to other large organisations, public or private sector. So they can go, let's say, to the government of Denmark and say, look, we're running the Inland Revenue IT for the UK, we can do yours too. We've got, or New Zealand or China or wherever it is. And so this bottom right-hand corner is very important, and that you get a kind of a snowball effect, so that as these companies grow, and as they acquire knowledge, and as they acquire economies of scale, and develop their own internal global division of labour, with some tasks, some in Ireland and some in India, wherever, the price of what they offer gets lower. So it becomes harder and harder for their customer companies to justify keeping things in-house. It's like you're still going to a private tailor when you can buy your clothes from that chain down the road for half the price, So but it means that the labour processes of all these workers are, of course, dictated by these global companies. It probably, here in this university, I don't know what's outsourced here, but there's an amazing amount of this going on. Anyway, so this is the sort of basic framework. I'm just sort of making the point here that the logic of standardisation and simplification and elaboration of value chains that's been going on in manufacturing is also going on in services. You're seeing the same pattern of standardisation, fragmentation, and the introduction of a spatial division of labour. And new sectors are emerging. The IT sector is interesting to look at, because 30 years ago there wasn't an IT sector. There were companies that made computers, and there were people who were employees of lots of different companies who were IT workers or employees of those companies. And because it was one of the first things to be outsourced, these new companies, these new sectors that supplied IT services are becoming visible as a new sector. And that new sector is behaving exactly like a manufacturing industry in the way it's developing its own internal long value chains and its own internal spatial division of labour and so on. Sorry, I think I've said these things. I just want to emphasise the point that I always emphasise, that when people talk about a knowledge-based economy or a knowledge-based society or knowledge-based sectors or creative workers or whatever, this isn't something new that's come from nowhere. This is just an expression of the elaboration of the division of labour across the economy, that these jobs have become split off from other jobs. The knowledge was always there, it was just incorporated into other sort of bundles of skills before this took place. Anyway, so that's... so I think sorry, maybe this is not appropriate for this audience, but it's always something I emphasise when I'm talking to people in trade unions, is that it's an incremental process, that it's very rare for people to be working in a traditional way one day, in a nice office in Toronto, and then overnight, bang, everybody's unemployed and the jobs have gone to India. It's an incremental process. First of all, things are standardised, then they're market tested, then they're outsourced, and it might not happen in this sequence or in quite that way, because these things are alternatives to each other. But there's this long journey, and staying complacent until you've reached stage number 4 in this sequence is, you've lost by the time you've got to stage number 4. Workers should start being alert at stage number 1 if they want to stand any chance at all of organising effectively around what's going on. And I think the other thing that's important to remember is that this modularisation, this sort of Lego brick logic, doesn't lead to any particular necessary pattern. People say, oh, well, one minute you're talking about centralisation, the next minute you're talking about decentralisation. What is the trend? And there isn't a trend, it's an either-or. The options for employers are multiplying all the time. And this debate is now coming up around the crisis. Does the crisis mean more offshoring or less offshoring? Employers have just got a whole lot of choices about what to bring back, what to offshore, what to give to home workers, what to do in an office. What, you know, these are all options. So I think it's also, you know, empirically you can observe that very different types of value chains emerge in different industries. You know, that for historical reasons, you know, you've got supplier-driven ones and customer-driven ones, and etc. etc. I won't bother to go into that. So I'm now, before I finally get onto the crisis, I'm just going to sum up what we found in this enormous research project, which is sort of the situation that the crisis has, so to speak, added to. It's the existing situation in Europe when the crisis happened, if you like. We found, of course, huge national differences, huge sectoral differences, but we did find some common trends that affected, you know, fashion designers, R&D people in IT, logistics workers, production workers in the textile industry. We selected a range of business functions in sectors to study. The common trends we found that at every level there wasn't a case study where there wasn't intensification of work. Intensification in terms of the range of things that a worker was expected to do, and the sort of pressure to meet targets and so on as well. And of course, linked with that, but separable in a lot of, analytically separable in a lot of contexts, was a speed up of the pace of work, which could be driven by need to respond to the market more quickly, by in places like in call centres and in production industries, just jacking up the quotas and the targets that have to be met. More subtle in some other sectors. I mean, these both, I guess, would apply to academic work in Canada. They certainly apply to academic work in the UK, which, of course, was having very dramatic effects on the quality of life. We did organisational case studies, but we also interviewed people individually in some depth. Sort of biographical interviews, looking at how their lives had changed over the last 10 years and how they expected them to change in the future. And we found these really deep anxieties about what was happening in their personal lives as pressures of work took over. And again, that varied quite a lot from country to country. In the UK, people, you know, were kind of, yeah, that's the way it's been for quite a while. In countries like Germany and Sweden, it was still quite a new shock, you know, but it was, that was there. We found that white-collar workers were particularly affected by these trends, not because they're worse for white-collar workers, but they're newer for white-collar workers. Blue-collar workers have been dealing with speed up, you know, for decades. They increasingly had to work to externally determined targets. As value chains become more complex, the targets that workers have to work to are not set by their own employers. So they can't negotiate over them because they're told it's in the SLA, the service level agreement. There's a wonderful article in that last issue of the journal that's just been passed around, done by an Indian researcher, Pramila de Cruz, who did a study in a call centre in India, and looks at the way everything is blamed on the SLAs. So the workers in the call centre who are terribly bullied, she talks about institutional bullying in this article, they don't blame their managers for bullying them, because all the blame is placed externally onto these client companies that are setting the SLAs. It's a very, very interesting analysis. They have to work across time zones increasingly, which is a huge stress. Increasingly, workers whose job description in the past would have been just like to be a software programmer or to be a customer service, whatever, you know, or a fashion designer or whatever it is. Increasingly, it has to interact directly with clients and absorb the demands of clients and not say no to the clients. And this kind of client-related pressure. We also looked at some very big survey results from the European Working Conditions Survey. This stress coming from the need to relate to clients, or what they call market demands in the Working Conditions Survey, has dramatically increased just in the last 8 or 9 years in Europe. Really very, very dramatic. They have to increasingly participate in what you might call just-in-time staffing schemes, where everybody's under stress, and then at the last minute they'll bring in some temps or bring in a freelancer, or, and also there's a huge multiplication of different contractual forms. You have more and more situations where workers are sitting alongside other workers with completely different kinds of contracts. Some are on short-term contracts, some are on long-term contracts. Some are on contracts that were inherited from their previous employer, which don't match. People sitting on the next desk to each other doing identical same thing, because one's got an inherited contract from another employer that gave them a pension deal and the other one hasn't. They're working alongside each other on these different conditions, which actually makes makes organising terribly difficult. They are increasingly having to exercise, what you might call emotional skills or communication skills, and increasingly be penalised for not exercising them, for having attitude problems, and things like that. And what the other rather depressing thing that we found was, although there has been some organised resistance to change, there's actually been very, very little trade union engagement. What we found particularly was that quite a lot of our case studies, there was a trade union there was a negotiating structure in place, things were being negotiated, but the negotiating agenda was completely at odds with, like, they were negotiating about different things. The things that were the problems were not part of the negotiating agenda. And it was almost, I'm writing something at the moment, but it was like there are different forms of control in place. The unions were still operating in a world where bureaucratic forms of control worked. And so by negotiating a change in the rules, they would be doing the right thing, because their traditional agenda was about making fair rules, if you like. But increasingly, the rules were irrelevant, because people were working a 70-hour week anyway, because they had to meet their targets, and they were ignoring the rule that said a 40-hour week. So there was this mismatch between the trade union negotiating agenda and what was actually going on in the management strategy. And of course, in merger situations. One of the backgrounds to this, I have to say, is that in 2004, 2005, which are the last years for which there's good data on this, 60% of the growth of European companies came through acquisitions and mergers, not through investing in greenfield sites. So a very high proportion of the workforce globally have been affected by mergers and takeovers, and which, it's a huge challenge for trade unions, but it's also it's a form of restructuring that is not, and of course increasingly, because as David Harvey of course predicted so accurately would happen, the companies that are doing the taking over are companies from the global south. They're Chinese companies, Indian companies, Brazilian companies, with very, very different traditions of collective bargaining, if any, and it's a very different landscape from the one that the sort of formal rules say that the trade unions should be negotiating in, if you like. So, what is the impact of the crisis? I'm getting there. Shut me up if I'm going on too long here. Well, I'm now trying to get a handle on the impact of the crisis. I'm going back to my two categories of fixed and footloose workers. And there are, of course, contradictory trends in both. it's clearly the case that migrant workers are being laid off in very large numbers. In many industries, they're the first to go. They're the least organised. They're very often completely informalised work. They disappear very often. The jobs disappear in a way that doesn't even get picked up in the statistics. But a lot of people thought a year or so ago that this would mean massive reverse migration. And there is some reverse migration. In China, we've all read about, you know, the massive reverse migration to the rural areas from the urban areas. And in Europe, we've seen a certain amount of reverse Polish workers going back to Poland from Western Europe, especially from Ireland and France, and to a lesser extent from the UK. But actually very, very little. And it's same, there's been remarkably little. The latest statistics I've seen on it was a good report that was done. There's an Institute of Migration Studies in Washington that did a study. Most Mexicans are staying put in the United States. The inflow has gone down of migrants from Mexico, but there really are not that many going back. But what, I mean, of course, the Polish workers, I know somebody who's doing research on this in Poland. Polish workers are going back from when they do go back. There's a double whammy for the local community, because they left in the first place because there are no jobs. There are now even fewer jobs, and not only are they going back and cluttering up, you know, an already skewed labour market, but the remittances that they were sending back have been lost from that community. So it's this kind of double whammy. So I would say, if you want to sort of really, really generalise, migrants are staying put rather than going back in most countries, but there are huge variations in this pattern. And the loss of remittances is the biggest thing. I was talking a month or so ago to a young Romanian researcher who's been doing research on poverty in Romania, and she says in the last year in this former industrial town in Romania where she's been doing her fieldwork, people are now, the adults are down to 1 meal a day so the kids can eat, you know. There's like real poverty. This is within the EU. And that's because of remittances not coming back. Because these economies in the, you know, up until 2006, you know, between the accession of Bulgaria and Romania, they were the last two countries to join the EU, they became remittance economies, very large, but huge regions, not obviously the whole economy. And so, so this is really very a serious issue. But the statistics I could find on this showed enormous variations. Like in Turkey, it's absolutely plummeted, remittances. Some of this could be to do with exchange rate variations, you see. And I haven't been able to look at these figures in detail and see. Some of it could be an effect of devaluations of currencies and things like that. But it looks as if the remittances to the Philippines are holding up quite well compared with remittances to Turkey, let's say. Those were two extremes I found in the statistics. But it's a complicated picture and a lot more research needs doing on it. I suspect getting a mole who works for Western Union would be the best way of doing some good research on this. But obviously, this can have a catastrophic effect on an economy. If you go to somewhere like the Dominican Republic, you know, there's a huge dependence on remittances. And I think this is something that's often not seen, you know, by the working class of the developed country worried about their own unemployment. But of course, added to that is the hardship to the migrant workers who are staying put in the developed world, but who are now unemployed, and who are very often outside the scope of any kind of social welfare system, who are really pauperised by these developments. But you see, you also have the contrary trend of a lot of employers, and you see this very dramatically in Greece. The way they deal with the crisis is a wholesale substitution of migrant workers for indigenous workers, so they can tear up the union agreement and pay them a fraction of what they were paying before. So, and I, you know, there's evidence in London too that that quite a lot of employers are, and the company that does IT support from Analytica, they've just laid off 2 English workers and kept a Polish and a Bangladeshi worker. Presumably because they're paying them quite a lot less. They've laid off their most expensive workers first. So it's a complicated situation. Oh, sorry. There's the reference to that study. I recommend it. It's very. If you want figures, it's a good one. It was commissioned by the BBC from this institute in Washington. So that's the fixed workers. Moving to the offshore workers, we see similarly very, very contradictory trends indeed. So we'll go back to that. I mean, if you talk to people in India, they say there are mass layoffs, the BPO sector is decimated, call centre jobs are disappearing every day, there are all these unemployed IT people in Bangalore. You know, America sneezes, India catches a cold. Clearly that is a significant trend. Whether that more jobs have disappeared there than have disappeared in the US is another question. You know, has it fallen proportionately the same, or has it fallen more, or has it been more, because of this spatial division of labour, is it just very, very concentrated in certain places and therefore very visible? But there's also another very clear trend, which is that employers are seizing on the recession as an excuse to get rid of their best protected core workers in the developed countries. I've got a bit of evidence of this. Again, it's very. First of all, we can look at the growth of these big global companies that supply the outsourced services, and they certainly haven't stopped growing. But end of 2008, so this is looking at the outsourcing divisions of these companies, not the companies as a whole. Accenture up 15%, IBM up 8% in a broader way, but if you look at their what they call their growth markets, which is outsourcing especially to, well, especially India and China, but also some parts of Latin America, that was up 25%. CSC doubled its new order bookings in the last quarter. These companies are actually doing very nicely. I'm on the mailing list of a thing called the National Outsourcing Association, which promotes outsourcing. And they've had a rash of seminars about how to profit from the recession, you know, which customer segments are. There was one 2 weeks ago about retailing, you know, target retailing, because the retailers are you know, going to be wanting to outsource more in the next few weeks. So that's going up. A US survey recently showed that 42% of companies were planning to outsource more. This is companies that were already outsourcing, were planning to outsource more in the near future. UK survey this summer, June, by the CBI. This was a random survey, but a large survey covering. They do these regular surveys. It's a survey that covers the employers who employ about 3 million workers in the UK. It's a lot of big employers. 26% said they were planning or considering moving jobs overseas in response to the recession. It was a special survey about what are you doing in response to the recession. 55% said they were planning pay freezes, and 26% said they were thinking of offshoring. So, but without reliable statistics, I mean, it is very, very difficult to disentangle the short-term trends from the long-term trends. But it seems to me that what is happening is a massive, so to speak, a disciplining of labour. I've always argued that offshoring isn't about destroying jobs in their millions in the developed economies. It's about disciplining labour in those economies. Offshoring enough jobs, obviously to take advantage of the cheap labour, but to make sure that American workers know that their job might go to India, you know. or whatever. And arguments about how many jobs are beside the point, because it's not a zero-sum game anyway. But it seems to me that this disciplinary effect on labour, it's operating at every level. I mean, here we see, on the one hand, you know, the workforce staying at home is being threatened with pay freezes and further restructuring of the sort that we saw earlier. On the other hand, putting out press statements saying, oh yeah, we're going to bring you, we'll have all UK call centres by next year and such a bank. But the reality is that more and more jobs are going, they might not be call centres jobs, they might be other kinds of jobs, but more and more things. But most scarily, the British government reckons it can make savings of, I forgot to bring the press cutting with me, I think it was 6 billion by offshoring civil service jobs. This is our dear New Labour government. But anyway, so you know, so Labour is really being walloped. You know, I think is the conclusion. So what are the changes? You know, what are the responses to this? First, one of the things that I see as a little bit hopeful is that if you went back, say, 4 or 5 years, the debates about offshoring that were taking place in the trade union movements, there was still a kind of sense among workers that there were kind of national companies, and that if it was good for your national company, workers would have to make some sacrifices, but it would be good for the national economy, because if your national company does well, then somehow the benefit will come back and accrue nationally. And I think this is now being really exposed. I mean, partly just because of the sort of mergers that we were talking about. All these iconic national brands like InBev breweries in Belgium, you know, owned by a Brazilian company. All the European steel industry, about which there was, that's what started the common market, was trying to protect the European steel industry, you know, and steel workers fought for their jobs through the 70s, through the 80s, now entirely owned by Indian companies. The IBM PC, the iconic kind of product of the sort of IT revolution of the 80s, the IBM PC was it. It was the first mass product, really, computer product, owned by China, Chinese company. I think workers are starting to realise this, and they're starting to see companies as global in a way that they didn't. So I think in terms of consciousness raising, that's probably a good thing. It's only a little glimmer of hope. I think we are seeing, we saw this in Germany, we're seeing it in the UK, a disillusionment with social democratic parties and corporate institutions. Whether this is going to lead to demands for a kind of new Keynesianism, we're seeing signs of this now. It's saying, well, the solution is to create jobs making windmills or, you know, whatever. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for new Keynesianism. Whether that will become a dominant trend or not, I don't know. Leo probably can tell you much better than I can, but it seems to me that that's something that's happening quite quickly. I think we're going to see, and I don't know what this means, but I think we're going to see a permanent drop in wages in the developed economies relative to those in the rest of the world. And we've already seen a bit of that over the last 10 years. But I think it's going to dramatically fall in a way that it's not going to come back up again. And I think we have to think of the implications of that. And I think it's going to mean effectively a kind of massive proletarianisation, if you like, of a lot of jobs that were seen as middle class in previous decades. I think we have to think through what that might lead to. It might lead to the most horrible protectionism, racism, you know, who knows. But I think there are glimmers of new forms of trade union organisation and international solidarity. But there's always this sort of, you know, the way we do want to be optimists and clutch at straws, you know. There are straws to be clutched right now, but how strong they are, I don't know. So I think I'll end there really on those questions.
Well, thank you very much.